Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and it is 2022, which means it's time to watch Soylent Green from 1973. Now, if you're on the internet a lot, like I am, and you're on YouTube, so you're probably on the internet a lot, you've probably seen people mention, oh yeah, Soylent Green is set in 2022. I don't think many people have actually watched Soylent Green. I think everybody just knows it because it's arguably the most spoiled movie of all time. And I've been meaning to watch it for, certainly a few years now. So I thought I'd finally get around to it, in keeping with the year, and see what it was all about. Now, right off the bat, I was not really excited to watch this, and I did not expect that I was going to like it very much. For one, it's a dystopian film set in the made in the 70s, which is usually not a recipe for some really quality filmmaking. And it's also starring Charlton Heston, who I don't particularly care for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is I don't think he's a particularly good actor. However, I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised by substantial portions of this film. I definitely did not have high hopes, and I was actually quite enjoying quite a lot of this film. However, there's a lot to unpack with it. And I'm going to do this in two parts. One where I don't talk about the film at all in terms of the content. I am going to, I think, fairly assume that everybody knows the line from this film. And so I am going to treat the rest of this as though that is the case. If you don't want that spoiled at all, if you don't want the meme spoiled, if you've somehow escaped all versions of the internet and everybody who's ever seen of or heard this film, go watch it now. Otherwise, I'm going to mostly treat that as not a spoiler. However, I am going to also talk about the larger structure and why it doesn't work. Towards the end, I will signpost that when I do so. So, what I was most surprised about is that it is not what it immediately appears to be. Based on the poster alone, it looks like some sort of dystopian thriller, running and escaping and all these other sorts of things. And ultimately, most of the film is nothing like that. That was the first surprise. The film opens with introducing the world in a way that I initially didn't think worked at all. It felt very stilted. And then, by the end of it, I was kind of thinking it worked pretty well. It's just basically a slideshow of pictures going from, essentially early industrial pastoralism to modern society, and trying to illustrate without words the acceleration of the population at the time. The first proper shot of the film says, I think it says New York City specifically, but it says 40 million people, which is a bit of a high mark compared to where we actually are now. However, it is worth noting that at the time, in 1973, there were more than a few concerns about the accelerating population, and it's worth noting that the population today is almost exactly double what it was in 1973. If you're not familiar with human growth metrics, it's interesting. The population of the Earth in 1973 was less than 4 billion people. Here we are. So, in addition to a bunch of other new science that was coming out at the time, not the least of which was some of the not even the earliest, but some of the like early widespread recognition of things like climate change, and a renewed view on pollution issues and resource extraction. And that is what I think is most fascinating about the film, is it actually paints, I hesitate to say a realistic, but a decently well thought out picture of a resource scarce world. Now, I could sit here for a long time and talk about how every dystopia movie seems to get like a resource scarce dystopia wrong in one way or another, not the least of which is just like it devolves to anarchy faster than it would, and certain things are prioritized in odd ways. But this film actually does a surprisingly good job of painting a pretty reasonable picture, and not doing some of the mistakes that I commonly have seen in other films and other pieces of media. There are some things that I think are really there just for show. One of the standouts is that in more than a few scenes, both in day and night, there are people just strewn by the dozens on floors, and every stairway is covered in sleeping people, which, while it's not like obviously, it's very common for homeless people to end up in stairwells and things like that because they tend to be protected from the elements and things like that. But it's really for show so that Charlton Heston can literally step over like masses of people and really sort of bluntly but not ineffectively emphasize this idea of the city that they're living in and the world that they're living in is severely overpopulated. That said, aside from a few things like that, there are some very like practical and reasonable considerations taken for what a scarcity economy would look like. Obviously, one of the core features of this world is abject poverty, and these, the idea of the quote unquote bread line, where so much of the world, the kind of thing that was more common to be seen in, something like Depression era United States and those sorts of things, but in a much more widespread and severe fashion. They really hit home that like everything is scarce, including, water, electricity, all these other things. But they don't go overboard in, meant to turn that off. They don't go overboard in, like really hammering it into your head that these things are missing. They're just they're presented largely in very everyday ways. Practical, just nobody's explaining it. Everybody's just like, this is how we live. And some of us are old enough to remember when it wasn't like this. And to that extent, like even the reminiscing of older characters is genuinely kind of powerful. Special credit to Edward G. Robinson, who plays, this is, I believe, his, if I understand correctly, this was his last ever film role. He literally died several days after they finished filming. And by all accounts, everybody knew he was dying on the set. And there were very emotional moments in the film that were, further filled in by a legend of the film industry, basically actively dying while the movie was being filmed. And he has he does a great job in every scene that he's in, but there's one particular moment, and the way his performance is great, but also the way it's written, the way his reaction is written to this certain moment and this certain reminiscing of how things used to be. It doesn't come off as cheesy or as some sort of, yeah, we get it, old man, or anything like that. It's very genuine and heartfelt. And I was genuinely taken aback because it's reasonably early in the film. And it's a much more nuanced view and a nuanced take than I expected, especially from a film with Charlton Heston in it, but he's just an actor anyway. So as far as like comparing to other things at the time, I feel like this is a much more, and again, I hesitate to say realistic, but reasonable take on things. Even one other thing that I noticed that I really appreciated is, since so much of this film is about, it's about this, scarcity economy and this world of widespread destitution and homelessness. And unsurprisingly, part of the counterpoint to showing that is also showing some people who are rich, because there are, of course, people who are rich. And one of the really common issues in dystopian films and things is that the rich people are completely unaffected by the destitution around them. And there's some cases where that's appropriate. Some worlds in which that just sort of makes sense. And there's others like this one where no, these rich people are rich and they have access to lots of resources, but there are some things that just don't exist anymore or are impossible to make, to find, or like so rare as to be completely novel, even to the incredibly some of the most wealthy people in the world. And that really adds, I think, another level of believability to the world, that it's not a totally us versus them moment. The overall arc of the film is kind of fascinating in that light as well, because it touches back into the idea of these wealth disparities and class disparities, but unfortunately it goes not quite far enough in my view, in using that towards its storytelling. But I think, well, let me pause there and we'll come back to that in a moment. If only because that's going to be in the full-blown spoilers area. Right now, I'm going to, do the classic line and say, the key thing in this film is that Soylent Green is people. There are people being collected and recycled into food. And that is an interesting and questionable take because, well, one, it's totally impractical. Raising humans or even recycling humans into any sort of consumable thing is like totally bizarre and beyond reality in terms of efficiency. Sure, there's like a waste not, want not principle there, but it's just like unviable in terms of the resources that would be required to do such a thing, let alone the morality or nutritional considerations or medical considerations. But I digress. It is an interesting consideration in that the whole, like the end of the film is him saying the line, is him going, Soylent Green is people. And weirdly, that doesn't work. It's possibly the worst moment in the film. It doesn't work because what is anyone going to do? Even if everybody was in agreement that, yes, this is terrible, ultimately the world that they've presented is a world in which kind of doesn't matter. There's lots of people and they need to eat, and they probably care more about surviving than they do about eating people. And presuming they've processed it enough such that you're not going to get like prion disease or whatever, we're just going to assume they've done their homework on this, which is more credit than they deserve. Ultimately, are those people going to care? The people in such destitution that they can't, they don't have a choice. They get what they get, basically. They're not going to be in an uproar and be like, fix it. I mean, this is a world too far gone to fix that issue. And I think that's sort of deliberate structurally for them to have the end of the film capped off like that. But it is not, it's the kind of thing that makes me wonder. This is based on a short novel or a novel or something. I don't remember. I'm curious whether in the original context, I could imagine it ending in the same way, but I would imagine that the internal monologue of the character to say, Soylent Green is people, what do I do about this, is probably a little bit more nuanced than it ends up being in the film. But this is getting into a structural issue with the film, which is that the whole Soylent Green is people thing only really hits in the last third of the film. It's kind of not even the focus, and to have the film capped off like that, I think is possibly the worst thing they could have done. So from here on out, I'm going to I need to use framing, a discussion of the framing of the early part of the film. So if you're interested in seeing this, and I do actually pretty highly recommend it if you have any interest at all, I would watch it first and then come back at this timestamp, which is like 1650. Anyway, from here on out, I'm going to start spoiling. So the whole framing of the film from the beginning is that the main character is a detective investigating a murder. And through a variety of different reasons, he starts to uncover what appears to be a conspiracy. And this is an interesting thing because it hits on a couple of different genres. It's not just plain science fiction. It's getting into police procedurals and sort of the idea of the rogue cop or the cop who won't give up on a case because this, that, and the other is happening, gets into discussion of like corrupt police and so many other things. This film has so many things that are pertinent to our modern society in an alarming way. But he goes to this house, he sees this splendor, which he hasn't really ever had an experience of, and proceeds to basically loot the place, which is fascinating on its own because he is a police officer, but it's also obvious that like the police are kind of a ragtag group of guys. They're organized, but it's the political and social structure of this world, of the city, is hard to pin down and is kind of not relevant because the part of the point is this sort of descent into pseudo social anarchy, but in a much more realistic way than say like Mad Max or whatever, or Escape from New York or something like that. But he goes in there with this attitude of I'm going to loot the place, and then discovers through his book, whose name I forget, and the older guy, his police book, that like the main character may not even be literate. It's a little bit unclear, but he happens to pull these two books off the wall because they're big books and they look expensive or something like that, and he's just kind of looting the place. And they discover ultimately this conspiracy that like there's been so much ecological damage caused by these various companies, and that they've procedurally kept it to themselves, that they have destroyed their former sources of food, being, the oceans, being plankton and things like that. And subsequently, like this is a world in complete collapse because there's basically there appears to be no longer any sustainable way to provide people food. And Soylent, as they say, is like controls most of the world's food. So how do they go from there? They don't have a lot of options. The unfortunate reality is that they go for mulching dead people and possibly live people too. It's a weird thing when they call for the scoops are coming. It's like it's such a weird scene. It's like a standout weird scene that the scoops just scoop people up and dump them in the back. And it's unclear what happens to those people, whether they are being riot controlled or whether they're then being sent to be processed. It appears from what we see directly, the only thing that they process is corpses. And that's also presented really badly, but we may or may not get there at some point. So they've hidden all this, and there's this conspiracy building, and there's these other powerful people who have contracted thugs of various levels to do assassinations, did this killing, and are trying to cover up the rest of it. But the question that arose in my mind, and this really covers the first 2/3 of the film, is like, okay, what is the conclusion here? Are we looking at uncovering the conspiracy, finding out who the other people in power are, and trying to hold them accountable for these things? And the answer is no. It takes such a weird pivot at the third act for him to go, oh, my friend went to this euthanasia clinic. I was so sad about it. He went there because he found out this thing from the library. He went to the library, talked to these other bookish librarian types. They all collectively discovered that the world is even more horrible than they thought. And he decided to get euthanized. And fair enough. But then for Charlton Heston's character to then follow his corpse kind of on a whim, other than, well, not really on a whim, because he basically tells Charlton Heston, like on his deathbed, oh, you gotta find the truth. This is there. It's unclear what he actually says, but it's like, he doesn't react like he was told that Soylent Green is people. He reacts like he was told there's something sinister, but it's not clear, even though he says, like, you gotta find the proof. Anyway, for him to then go, like, it's so bizarre because rather than having any conclusion to any of the plot lines around like this conspiracy to keep Soylent in power and to cover up their misdeeds and how they keep this under wraps in the first place, and people have to be in this factory. There are visibly people in this factory that's making Soylent Green. Like how any of that works. There's something to be said for suspension of disbelief, but when the focus seems to be on this conspiratorial part of it, which was the much more interesting, compelling, and like human element of, you know, somebody then going and potentially confronting the board of Soylent saying, what the hell is wrong with you people? Like those are the human moments. That's when you have free reign as a writer to like confront the viewer with the moral quandary in a more overt way, for the main character to shout at this board and say, you monsters, what have you done? You've destroyed us, whatever else. And that would have been like one of the few times Charlton Heston would actually have been an appropriate casting for this role, because that's the only thing Charlton Heston does. He does everything at 150%, and having him stand on a table and shout at like a bunch of rich business people would have been an amazing moment. Comparatively speaking, instead what we get is he just follows this garbage body compactor thing to the factory, walks through it very briefly, and we don't like see anything. And while I totally understand that it would have been not only expensive, but potentially excessively gruesome to show how the bodies are processed. He literally goes from, okay, the bodies are getting dumped, and then they go on this conveyor belt, and then they go into this pond, and then it spits out green crackers. Like, and those last two steps happen in the course of like 30 seconds. He doesn't see anything new. He doesn't like show any great revelation. He's just like, oh no, it's the crackers. And then he, like, again, they almost get to it, but the movie ends far at the wrong place, basically. He gets followed because they've discovered, the people in power have discovered that he is onto them. They send assassins after him, and the movie ends with him being essentially assassinated, still telling the truth to this church full of people, but that's where it ends, rather than there being any moment of even like a confrontation with one of the thugs. He could have had to go, do you know who you're working for? Do you know what they're trying to kill me for? Do you know what they're trying to cover? Anything like that, to just remind us that there's this larger picture that he was working at in the first place, that there's a larger thing that is the whole reason why he was starting to get in trouble. There's these moments where we see, you know, his superior officer getting, paid off to make this this thing go away. There's a couple of other things. It's not absent throughout the entire film. It's very apparent throughout the first 2/3. And then it's just this weird pivot to focus on this one element of the food being people, which isn't that compelling at all. As I mentioned at the beginning of the film, like, what are this in a world in collapse? Who's actually going to think that that's the worst thing happening? It's not. Like, that's not the worst thing happening in that society at that point. It's borderline social anarchy, and terrible people are doing terrible things. Our own main character, though he's at some point portrayed as being, you know, somewhat reasonable and trying to protect the weak and the those who cannot protect themselves, like, he still steals a whole bunch of stuff from a murdered man's home. He sleeps with okay, we got to take a moment and talk about the furniture, which is this whole thing of, in wealthy people's homes, the apartments come with furniture, and by furniture it means a woman. Which is, like, where to even start with that. It's interesting in the context of the 70s, with this sort of social transition that's happening for women between the 50s and early 60s kind of idea of the post-war housewife, to women being more in the economy, having jobs, having regular lives that weren't surrounded by being mothers, and as well as social movements to liberate women from these long-held social strictures and all these other things. And so it's a timely comment in that way on social changes of the time, and sort of regression towards objectification, very literal objectification, by calling them furniture, and they are attached to the property rather than, being people. But on the other hand, there's like part of me that has some thoughts about our very modern viewpoint. And I don't get me wrong here, I'm not equating the two things here, but there are some very recent social changes as far as people of any gender in doing sex work, and the sort of destigmatization of sex work as an occupation. And so there's some element of it that doesn't quite hit the same way. If I think at the time the view would have been like, any woman in sex work is the lowest of the low, these very stigmatized views of, or stigmatized. I'm not sure which one it is. Possibly both are valid. I'm not sure. Of women doing that kind of thing in the 70s is a very different viewpoint. But it's so especially weird because it's not like all women are relegated to that. It's basically just pretty women hired. I don't think they're like, it's unclear. They don't seem to be slaves. They don't seem to be necessarily owned. It seems to be a world in which this is very normalized. And in particular, the moment where Charlton Heston has this sort of relationship, big air quotes, with the woman who, the furniture woman of the murdered man. And they both act about it with a nonchalance that is kind of stunning. And it's rather unclear whether or not we are supposed to believe this as like a normal aspect, like regardless of social mores and these other things, either in the 70s or now, about whether that's a fair exchange. But they act in a way in which like it's just sort of normal. And like, even when he goes to interrogate the bodyguard, or he knows the bodyguard isn't there, but he then talks to the woman there, and she at the end, although she's clearly has ulterior motives of trying to, hide the jam from him, like just offers, like says that she should have offered, she wasn't very nice. And she seems to see that it's not necessarily like as not a big deal. And so like, I just wanted to touch on that because it's so weird, and like deeply concerning on a respecting human people level, but also in a way of like seeing as a science fiction aspect that's often not really interrogated very well, and trying to understand how that social structure is supposed to be perceived within the world versus how it is meant to affect us as we experience it as a viewer outside of said world. I don't know. If anybody has any thoughts about that, I'd love to hear them, because it's a really weird thing. I'm definitely going to try and think if there's anything else, any other media that has a similar or a similarly interesting take on that sort of thing. Anyway, I got way off base. Where was I going with this? Oh, well, so our main character is like, has this nonchalant attitude towards being kind of a shitty person. And while he's not a villain or anything, and in fact, he's in the context doesn't seem to be a particularly bad person. This is a world in which everything's fallen apart so much that getting what you can where you can get it is sort of very normalized. Even within, like, he talks to his boss, and his boss says, "What'd you get?" And he said, "I took everything I could get." And his boss just sort of laughs and says, "Yeah, that makes sense." And it's unclear whether that's because it's like police corruption, boys club, doing shitty things because they have power kind of thing, or whether that's just normal for the world they're in. And the world is so terrible that it's kind of hard to separate all that. And the idea of, to come back around, Soylent Green being people, not being the worst thing that's probably going on to or with any given person, assuming let's say they're not executing people, they're not taking those rioters to be executed and turned into food, but maybe they are. Let's assume they're not. As long as they're not actually executing people at random, how many people are actually going to be completely upset by it? Anyway, I'm just looking at this cover art and the fucking scoops, man. The scoops are coming. The scoops are coming. Oh, what a bizarre scene. Anyway, let me go over a couple of these things. Just over my like little checklist here. Visually, the film. I should have talked about this earlier before I got into this larger discussion, but it seemed like a good transition point. This like the costumes. I talked about the setting as being like reasonably realistic. It's not a pretty film to look at, and I think there are ways to present a dystopian thing in a way that's not just brown, gray, and smudged all the time. So not super impressed in any way by the artistry or direction there. But it's still a very believable world. And the one other thing that is of particular note to me is there's some really bad editing. It's mostly acceptable, but there's more than a few cases where like there was no continuity editor on this, and it seems like, or if there was, they were very bad at their job because there's just several cuts where they cut between things within a scene and nobody did any continuity checking. So somebody's wearing something they weren't, or something is in a position where it wasn't. The worst of all, actually, the most absolutely terrible jarring thing is the in the execution or in the like euthanasia scene, they're looking at the panel and the light is blinking, and instead of having the light blink on the panel, they cut between film of the thing with the panel with the light on and film of the panel with the light off, except for there's a cable coming out of the panel, and it's at a different angle in each one. So you see the cable flopping around, and you couldn't make the panel blink, really? You had, or you couldn't at least ensure that cable was not showing off that there's no continuity checking going on here. It's so bad. It's terrible. It's terrible. But at that point, like, we're so close to the like turning point of this film is bad now that I mean, I guess it's the last sign of brace for impact. Anyway, this one's been a little longer. I hope you enjoyed the additional discussion, in the context of the film. If you enjoy this kind of thing, I can do more of it. Just leave a comment, let me know, and I will. Maybe in the future, I'll try and structure this a little bit better. Make sure I get my early thoughts out first, and then like the I've only done this for a few movies. This Lara Croft and maybe something else. But yeah, if you've made it this far, if you watched the film, if you didn't watch the film but enjoyed the discussion anyway, and whether or not you're going to then watch it, let me know. It's a fascinating movie. Had a lot more in it than I definitely expected it to have, and while it's a classic, it's not great, but it's definitely it's good enough to definitely be checking out. Anyway, thank you guys all for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. Happy New Year, and I'll see you guys next time.